Hello, students. Today we're going to be having an introduction to the ancient civilization of Mesopotamia. This video is going to go over some of the definitions in your journal, numbers 1 through 6, Fertile Crescent, through number 6, City-State. If you'd like to read along as well, you can also open up the textbook from our textbook section on the left-hand side column of your navigation in Google Classroom as well. Today I'm going to be reading the first half of section 2 in chapter 1 to you. Before I move further, there's two definitions that I wanted to take care of first. Number 1, Fertile Crescent, and 2, Cradle of Civilization. The map that we have in our textbook provides a good example for us of number 1, Fertile Crescent, which is defined as a region of Southwest Asia that was the site to the world's first civilizations. The reason why it's called the Fertile Crescent is because it's in a crescent-like shape, as you can see, and it was fertile, meaning that it was an area that was excellent for growing crops. As we learned at the end of the Neolithic Age, early groups of people are now going to be moving into river valleys because of farming, because of the soil nearby, and because of the access to fresh water is going to be extremely important for early farming communities. It's also called the Cradle of Civilization, which is number 2 in your social studies journal. And it's called the Cradle of Civilization, and we're going to define that as a nickname given to the Fertile Crescent region of Mesopotamia, because this area was home to several of the earliest civilizations. So this area kind of goes by a couple different names. It's called the Fertile Crescent region, talking more geographically about the crescent-like shape and the ability to grow crops in this area successfully. It's called the Cradle of Civilization because a cradle, similar to a baby that would be in the cradle to start off life, it's the cradle of civilization in terms of like this is just the very beginning of how early civilizations began to get organized. So it can be referred to as the Fertile Crescent from more of a geographical standpoint, and the Cradle of Civilization from more of a political standpoint. And we're going to see lots of different civilizations springing up in this area as we look at these early civilizations, such as Sumer and Babylon and the Assyrians and the Chaldeans and lots of other groups of people in this area. Today, this area is known as the Middle East. These two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates River, go through a country called Iraq. Over here is the modern-day country of Israel, modern-day country of Egypt. We have Syria, Jordan. And so this area of the world is called the Middle East. We'll talk a little bit later about what life is like today in the Middle East. But right now, we're at about, on the time period, we are at about approximately 3,500-ish BC when we start learning about the early civilization of ancient Mesopotamia. Those were the answers to the first two questions for you. Again, I just answered Fertile Crescent and Cradle of Civilization for you. Now I'm going to begin reading at Mesopotamia's civilization from our textbook. Again, you can follow along with me as I read. You can also access this in your textbook from Google Classroom if you would like to read it on your own. There's also an option when you open up Kami to have the selection read to you as well. So whatever it is that you choose to do. Mesopotamia's civilization. Civilization in Mesopotamia began in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Do you live in a region that receives plenty of rain or in a region that is dry? Think about how that affects you as you read how the Sumerians' environment affected them. Over thousands of years, some of the early farming villages developed into civilizations. Civilizations are complex societies. They have cities, organized governments, art, religion, class divisions, and a writing system. And that definition was given to us in our last section of our social studies journal. Why were river valleys important? The first civilizations arose in river valleys because good farming conditions made it easy to feed large numbers of people. The rivers also provided fish and fresh water and made it easy to travel and to trade. Trade provided a way for goods and ideas to move from place to place. It was no accident then that cities grew up in these valleys and became the centers of civilizations. As cities took shape, so did the need for organization. Someone had to make plans and decisions about matters of common concern. People formed governments to do just that. Their leaders took charge of food supplies and building projects. They made laws to keep order and assembled armies to fend off enemies. With fewer worries about meeting their basic needs, people in the river valleys had more time to think about other things. They developed religions and the arts. To pass on information, they invented ways of writing. They also created calendars to tell time. Early civilizations shared another feature. They had a class structure. That is, people held different places in society depending on what work they did and how much wealth or power they had. The rise of Sumer. The earliest known civilization arose in what is now southern Iraq on a flat plain bounded by the Tigris and Euphrates River. Later, the Greeks called this area Mesopotamia, meaning, quote, the land between the rivers. Mesopotamia lay in the eastern part of the Fertile Crescent, a curving strip of land that extends from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. We just answered number 3, by the way, for those of you following along. Mesopotamia had a hot, dry climate. In the spring, the rivers often flooded, leaving behind rich soil for farming. The problem was that the flooding was very unpredictable. It might flood one year, but not the next. Every year, farmers worried about their crops. They came to believe they needed their gods to bless their efforts. Over time, farmers learned to build dams and channels to control the seasonal floods. They also built walls, waterways, and ditches to bring water to their fields. This way of watering crops is called irrigation. Number 4. Irrigation allowed the farmers to grow plenty of food and support a large population. By 3000 BC, many cities had formed in southern Mesopotamia in a region that is known as Sumer. What were the city states? Sumerian cities were isolated from each other by geography. Beyond the areas of settlement lay mudflats and patches of scorching desert. This terrain made travel and communication difficult. Each Sumerian city and the land around it became a separate city state. It had its own government and was not a part of a larger unit. A city state, to define that for you, is basically an independent state made up of a city and the surrounding land and villages. We can think of today as a city state basically was like a small version of a country. They had their own rules, they had their own ways of doing things. You had pride in the city state that you lived in. You had your own government, you had your own army. So, really, at this time period, city states are the earliest examples of what later we would call countries. Sumerian city states often went to war with one another. They fought to gain glory and to control more territory. For protection, each city state surrounded itself with a wall. Because stone and wood were in short supply, the Sumerians used river mud as their main building material. They mixed the mud and crushed reeds, formed bricks, and let them dry in the sun. Hard waterproof bricks were used for walls, as well as homes, temples, and other buildings. Gods and rulers. The Sumerians believed in many gods. Later, we're going to refer to this as polytheism, a belief system in many gods. Each was thought to have power over a natural force or human activity, flooding, for example, or basket weaving. The Sumerians tried hard to please the gods. Each city-state built a grand temple called a ziggurat to its chief god. The word ziggurat means mountain of God or hill of heaven. Previously above, you can see this is an example of a ziggurat that was built in ancient Sumer. And again, the establishment of this polytheistic religion, the goal here for these early people was to explain the natural world around them. For example, the sun, or the rising and setting of the sun, or the stars in the sky, or why we had a good flood one year to help our crops and a bad flood another year, and we had a drought. So the gods and goddesses were created by these early civilizations to explain the natural world around them. Much of this natural world today we would explain through science. The early civilizations of Sumer and others in Mesopotamia didn't have that advantage of having science, so much of their natural world was explained through the gods and goddesses and the different mythology that they would have. To get back to the ziggurat, with tiers like a giant square wedding cake, the ziggurat dominated the city. At the top was a shrine or a special place of worship that only priests and priestesses could enter. The priests and priestesses were powerful and controlled much of the land. They may have even ruled at one time. Later, it was kings that ran the government. They led armies and organized building projects. The first kings were probably war heroes. Their position became hereditary. That is, after one king died, his son would then take over. And that concludes our first section of an introduction to ancient Mesopotamia.